Thanks. So when Matt invited me to debate on school choice, I said, oh, good, that'd be nice. What side do you think I'll be on? And he said, oh, I think you'll be against. I thought, yeah, that's kind of a relief because I'm slightly more comfortable on that side. When I'm not a die-hard opponent of school choice, and as you'll see, I support some programs, including some of the programs that Terry's mentioned. But when it turned out that as a consequence of this, I was going to be debating Terry, my feelings were mixed. On the one hand, sort of brilliant to meet and converse with someone whose work has been informing my own thinking for so many years. On the other hand, do I disagree with him enough to really make it a debate? Yeah, probably. So my initial comments have got sort of three interwoven themes. So one is some theoretical reasons for doubting that school choice can really harness the choices of parents to make schooling equitable and efficient. Then thoughts about the evidence on actually existing programs, and then some comments about other reforms. And I think, maybe the message is that my biggest reservation about school choice is that I think discussions of school choice, like the ones we're having, crowd out discussions of other kinds of reforms that I think we need. And in particular, I worry that discussions of school choice let politicians off the hook who don't want to implement the kinds of policies that I think low-income children really need in order to improve their education. So the first, I'm just going to sort of go through my comments. First is about equity. If we really care about equity, we cannot rely on school choice. Parents are inevitably and reasonably primarily motivated by benefiting their own children. And parents with better information, more time in education and cultural capital, and more money will use their choice-making powers to get better outcomes for their children, even if that results in worse outcomes for other children. And we can already observe this, as Terry said, in systems without formal school choice. More affluent families use their choice-making powers in ways that leave other people behind. Not only between schools, but even within schools. If you've been in a school, you're very aware of a school like the schools my children attend, which are very socioeconomically mixed. You're very aware of which parents go in to make sure their kids get the good teachers and which parents don't go in to make sure their parents get the good teachers. That will be replicated in a full school choice system. And England, I am not just some very pretentious person from Appleton, Wisconsin. I actually am English. And it has a countrywide school choice system, and I think you see this dynamic playing out there. It's had it since the late 1980s. So you might say, as Terry did, well, this dynamic already works through the housing market. So isn't it good to have school choice systems which open up school choice to poor families? And my answer to that is yes, sometimes. So let's talk about the Milwaukee voucher system for a little bit. It used to provide vouchers only for low-income families to send their children to low-cost private schools if they were dissatisfied with their assigned public school. Now, my read of the research is that it's pretty unclear whether, on average, those schools have benefited poor children. But I have to say that the way I read the evidence, as an outsider, I find it hard to believe that they don't benefit those children. Okay? Did you get the double negative? In other words, even though it's unclear, I think they probably do benefit the children who attend. And certainly, as someone whose neighbours are mainly white upper-middle-class families who chose their housing partly because of the quality of the local schools, I live about 85 miles from Milwaukee, I'm embarrassed. Indeed, I'm actually somewhat ashamed to hear my liberal neighbours opposing a programme which gives poor families of colour a few miles away some fraction of the choice that we have the privilege of enjoying. So I'm a cautious supporter, or at least I was a cautious supporter of the Milwaukee program. Now, the best argument, I've heard all the arguments that Terry went through against the Milwaukee program, as you can imagine, and I've had to valiantly, oppose them. The best argument that I would hear against it was from a friend, very close friend of mine who's in the Assembly, who would say, look, it's going to feed a bad political dynamic. There are two ways in which it feeds a bad political dynamic. First of all, it makes people think the problem is all about the schools and not at all about the conditions in which poor children live. And the second is, you've got Tommy Thompson, our former governor, and you've got the promoters of the Milwaukee voucher system, and they set it up, and it looks pretty good. But just you wait. Politicians will water it down. They'll make sure that wealthier families can get access to it, and then the incentives will change so that the schools have less incentive to pay attention to and cater well for poor children, and they'll try to sort of cream off the top of the more affluent families. And that is exactly what our Governor Walker did with the Republican legislature about, I don't know, time flies, like 5 years ago. He raised the cap, the income cap, from 175% of the poverty level to 300% of the poverty level. Now, teaching children who are at 250% of the poverty level is a hell of a lot easier than teaching children who are at 150% of the poverty level. And the voucher schools suddenly have an incentive to go for that demographic and not the more disadvantaged demographic. Do I oppose the Milwaukee? I had to go back and forth a lot in thinking about the comments. Am I now opposed to the Milwaukee voucher system? No, probably not. But the dynamic is bad. And it's worth pointing out, as Terry did, that vouchers only account for a very small part of the choice movement. 2.5 million children are involved in charter schools. And in most of the 42 states, charter laws that have them, charter laws are not designed to serve disadvantaged children in particular. On average, it's true that they do serve more disadvantaged children on the whole, but my read, for example, this is the evidence is a mix, right? So when I read the Credo report, I'm less impressed than Terry is with the overall performance of charters. I am cognizant that some states are not at all interested in serving disadvantaged kids, and their charter laws and their charter design shows that, and others are more interested in it. And of course, as an activist in any one of those states, I would not be pressing right now to try and get rid of charters. That horse has sailed or something. Something has happened that isn't going to come back. I'd be pushing for more regulation. And we have evidence that some charter schools, and I'm going to single out the Knowledge is Power program schools, KIPP, because we have very high quality, rigorous studies of KIPP schools, which do quite deliberately target low-income students of color in urban areas, do benefit the children that attend them. The evidence is not so mixed on that, and it's pretty compelling. And again, if you read the evidence the way I do, I suspect that the studies understate the benefit to those kids. However, we don't have much evidence at all on the effect of KIPP schools or the Milwaukee voucher system on the schools that surround them. We do know that the most disadvantaged children and families, and this is absolutely not a criticism of either program, but we do know that the most disadvantaged, the most disconnected children are not taking advantage of these programs. And they are concentrated into the traditional public schools, which other children are escaping. And it would be surprising to me if that wasn't having some effect on the quality of education that the other children who remain in those schools are having. When I talked to the authors of the KIPP studies, they were interested in this, like, okay, let's really try and figure out how to figure out what's going on with those other kids. But they didn't have, it wasn't a research question of theirs. And there's some reason to believe that KIPP, for example, depends on it for its success on those children not attending. It also, and the voucher schools in Milwaukee also, have a business model that would be very hard to replicate at scale. They depend heavily, in at least the voucher schools I know in Milwaukee do, and the KIPP schools, on early stage young teachers who don't have families, who are willing to devote many more hours than you should reasonably expect of teachers, given the kind of wages you're going to pay them later in their life. and burning them out, essentially. Again, that's not a criticism, that's not a reason not to have them, it's a reason not to think that you're going to get the benefits at scale. Okay, I want to say one more thing. Is that okay? Can I do two? Okay, well, I will do two. So the first thing is just look. This is a slightly orthogonal point, but I've got a joke, and I also want to make. I actually think parents are pretty bad choosers, and I don't think that's because they're poor. I agree with Terry that lots of these parents are on it; they have their children's best interests at heart. But I think it's incredibly hard to find out what's going on in schools. If you have children, ask them what they learned today. So mine do two things. I've got two who are still in school. One of them says, not much, which I guess is true. And the other one says, I say, what did you learn today? And he says, oh, I got so many yards and I took a catch and I had a handoff. I have no idea what he's talking about. Haven't got a clue. I assume it's math. But, you know, now I'm being frivolous there, but it's really hard to get into it, to figure out what's really happening to your kid in the school unless the school's really bad. Even if the school's really bad, in order to make a choice in a way that is going to discipline the schools, you have to figure out what would be going on with your kid in some other school. Not just any old other school, not a good school, but in the other schools that you have the choice of. And lots of times, even in a choice system, the various choices you have are all not very good. And when the schools are all not, are all pretty similar to one another, it would be crazy to move your school for a kid from one school to another school. Even if the other school is a little bit better, we know that moving schools, especially mid-year, but even at the end of year, is bad for the kids' education. You do not want a system in which kids are moving all the time. As I always say to my friends who are die-hard opponents of choice, the issue is not whether parents are bad choosers. The issue is whether parents are better choosers than the state, right? And states vary a lot in how good they are as choosers, but we know that, now, I am an American citizen, just to be clear, but what we know is that even the federal government and certainly many state governments have a long history of being bad choosers for poor children. And in particular, of being bad choosers for poor children who are not white. I would in fact trust the Swedish government with my children's education, but I wouldn't trust the state of Mississippi. So that explains my sympathy for choice programs that are designed directly to target low-income and otherwise disadvantaged children. But here's my final comment. I think we should try to improve the choices government makes for poor children. And although many of the reforms that I would like to see are compatible with choice, I think that arguments for choice often, not arguments for choice, but choice movements often distract attention from these other programs. So let me go through very quickly. I welcome the Common Core State Standards as a mechanism that will help create an infrastructure to improve instruction across all kinds of schools. We need better health and better mental health provision for poor families and children. We need better public health. We need local reforms, stabilizing rental markets to reduce movement from schools caused by families having to change residence. I think we need more stable employment law. Lots of children move school mid-year. Lots of children move school 1 or 2 or 3 times because their parents lose their jobs. Of course, partly because their parents weren't adequately educated in the first place, but partly because of the way the labour market works. Early childhood provision that better prepares low-income children to take advantage of school. Categorical aids and state funding formulae that specifically target low-income children. Wisconsin still does not have a categorical aid of that like that in our funding formula. We've had vouchers since 1990, but nobody has introduced a categorical aid of that kind. We need improved teacher training, which focuses more on instructional skills and less on what one elementary education student of mine, who tragically regarded her philosophy classes as where she learned her most useful practical teaching skills, calls ideal theory, i.e. teaching teachers how things ought to be, rather than teaching them how to teach the children that they'll actually encounter. Reforms to open up the principalship to teachers who are more interested in student learning than in the success of the football team. Introduction of instructional coaches and directors of instruction in middle and high schools. How can a school be serious about learning if it has a director of athletics on a principal's contract and no director of instruction at all? We can talk about football later. Changes in the salary structure so that teachers are rewarded for their effectiveness and to reflect the difficulty of attracting talented teachers in certain subject areas, etc., etc. We need those kinds of reforms. And it's notable that in Wisconsin, where the Republicans and a very pro-choice governor have had the legislature for quite a while now, they have not implemented reforms like that. They've not done anything about teacher education, which they could easily have done. They've not done anything about the principalship, which they could easily have done. And I worry that too much focus on choice takes the heat off those kinds of reforms.